The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the 5 Pillars of Authentic Performance Conversations, and welcome. We've got a very wide interest here today. We've got people from the public sector, the private sector, not-for-profits, and people from not only interstate but also overseas. So welcome everybody, and I hope whatever time it is there is, well, reasonably convenient for you. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard, so could I ask people to look to the right-hand side, and you'll see a question box there. Could you just type in clear, please? It's just useful for me to know that I'm not talking to myself for half an hour. Thanks, Layla. Okay, thanks, Emily. Great. Thanks, Renee. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is great. Now, the good news for you is that you will receive a copy of the recording at the end of this presentation, and I'll send it out to you this afternoon. And also, I'll send you a set of slides as well. So you'll get those because you've taken the trouble to spend a good half an hour with me exploring this whole idea of performance conversations. Okay, so let's get stuck into it. There's 3 things that I really want to cover in this short, sharp session of 30 minutes. I want to talk about conversations generally in the workplace. I want to talk about, of course, the 5 pillars and what they are. And I want to talk about some practical tools that might assist you to use these pillars in your day-to-day conversations with people in your workplace. The emphasis, of course, is on performance conversations, but, of course, any conversation will benefit from any of these 5 pillars. Okay, and look, the other thing is if you've got any comments or questions at any stage during the next half an hour, please type them in the question box there the moment you think of them, and I will address them as we go. I won't be leaving the sort of 5 to 10 minute ending where we wait for people to type in their questions and there's an awkward pause. So just type them in as you go, and I will make sure I keep an eye on them as well. And just remember, when you type in your question there, no one else can see it except me. Okay, so underway. Let's talk about conversations in the workplace, generally speaking. Couple of things that I want to touch on here that are important. Organisations are conversations. In a book that I wrote with Aubrey Warren, we use this phrase very often. Organisations are conversations. What do I mean by that? Well, basically it means that there are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands, and for very large organisations, millions of conversations going on every day. And they happen in the boardroom, they happen in the lunchroom, they happen in the car park, they happen even in the toilets. They happen everywhere. And so we can actually say that organisations are just a series of conversations going on all the time. So the question really is looking at the quality of the conversation and making sure that it's up to scratch. I think it's very interesting that a lot of people talk about the art of conversation. You know, people say, well, you know, it's a bit of an art form, or so-and-so's got the gift of the gab, or I dispute that. I don't believe that there is a great art to conversation. I think the fact is I'm having a conversation with you now. When we've finished this, you'll probably go off and have another conversation with someone else. Conversations are ongoing. They're happening everywhere at any time. So the point is that we're all fairly practiced at it. We all can do it, and we all do it, I think, probably better than we think. Of course, there are some tough conversations which require some extra skill, no question, and I don't dispute that, but the majority of conversations are fairly straightforward, and I think we're well practiced at those. So the question then is, have we lost the art of conversations? I mean, it's interesting that if you travel to work on public transport this afternoon or this morning or whatever time it is there, and you're going home on a Friday for your weekend, and I'd suggest you try something interesting if you're on the train or the bus or the ferry, is just look up from your mobile device and have a look around, and you'll notice that everyone's got their head buried in a mobile device. And what happens is when we get home, we bury ourselves in another device called the television, all the while making Facebook updates and so forth. So our whole life is spent in front of a screen now, and of course you're doing that right now. And one wonders whether we've actually lost the need for these old-fashioned one-on-one conversations. We still have them, of course, via text and email and all the rest, but I wonder. I was speaking to a manager the other day, and I talked to him about conversations, and he said to me, he said, look, we actually don't have time for conversations, which I thought was a very interesting phrase. I felt like saying, well, how do you communicate? But I didn't, of course. But the fact is that a lot of people think that conversations are not necessarily productive, or certainly the conversations we're talking about today. So what they do is they ignore them, or we won't open a can of worms. Kushner and Posner, Barry Posner and Jim Kushner, who wrote a book called Credibility, claim that leadership is a relationship. And I think that's a very interesting comment. Leadership is a relationship. My question to those two gentlemen is, how do you have a relationship? And I guess the answer is one conversation at a time. There is no other way. So if we're looking at having better working relationships with the people that we lead, then we need to have one conversation at a time. So there is no other way. There is no other way of building trust. There is no other way of building a good, solid, constructive working relationship than by doing it one conversation at a time. So we really can't avoid it, can we? And so I just wanted to set the scene before we moved into these 5 pillars, just to let you know what my thinking is around conversations. And I'd be more than happy, of course, to hear what your thinking is around that, either now or later on via email. So let's move on to the 5 pillars of conversation. This will come up on your screen very shortly. There we go. Whoop, gone. Coming back now. So, of course, I haven't filled in the 5 pillars. That's what I'm going to do for the rest of our time together. But the important thing I want to say about the model is that it is like the pillars of a foundation of a building. So if any of these pillars are missing, the foundation of the building is going to be less robust than it would be otherwise, but it still might be able to cope. So you'll notice that the 5 pillars, I've called it the 5 pillars because they are indeed the foundation of authentic conversations. Excuse me. Now, authentic conversations, I suppose, is another term for real conversations. So I'm talking about real conversations, not fake conversations. And as you see the 5 pillars, you can see how they relate to authenticity. So the first pillar is, and these aren't necessarily in order, they all relate to each other, and this isn't some sort of process that you work your way through. But one of the first pillars is to agree on expectations. Remember, these are performance conversations we're talking about. So it is extremely important and underrated that we don't necessarily agree on expectations. That is, your expectations as a leader of what you expect in your workplace. Let's just dive into that a little bit. If you think about it, it's quite complex, expectations. It's not just simply a case of you blurting out a time frame or perhaps some quality expectation and expect it's just going to happen. It won't. And I'm sure you're aware of that too, and you may wonder why. It may well be because of these 7 questions that I want to ask you, and I want you to have a think about these because they are critically important. Have you worked out in your own mind what your expectations are? Now, that might seem like a peculiar sort of question, but have you really thought carefully about that? As a leader in all of the facets of what you do in your work, have you absolutely crystal clear in your mind of the acceptable minimum level of performance across the board? Now, that's the first starting point, because obviously if you haven't got those, or they fluctuate from day to day, moment by moment, or project by project, or person by person, you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to confuse people. So you must have clear expectations to start with. Then the next question you've got to ask yourself is, have I communicated those expectations to other people? All right, and of course the key words there are consistent and persistent. So the question then is, have I persistently communicated? So this isn't just a one-off in a team meeting. And am I consistent in my expectations? So it never ends, and you've got to continue that process. The third question then is, does the other person, assuming it is one person or persons, of course, understand my expectations? So it's one thing to communicate it. It's quite another thing for them to actually understand what you're actually on about. And sometimes people are too polite or embarrassed to ask you to explain it because they're just not clear. So that's really important, because obviously if people don't understand, it doesn't matter how clear you are or how well you communicate. Do they accept your expectations? So it's one thing understanding it, it's another thing accepting it, isn't it? So the question is, okay, I understand it. Do I accept it? Is it a reasonable expectation? And of course, we know in sales environments, people put budgets, very ridiculously high budgets or expectations on their salespeople. And of course, the thinking is if we shoot for the stars, we'll get to the moon. But of course, the salesperson looks at that very suspiciously, and they don't accept the budget. And that in itself means that they don't accept the expectation, which is an artificial expectation set by the sales director or manager. 5, are they committed to meeting those expectations? So it's one thing accepting them, it's another thing committing to them. Now this isn't just a play on words. You can accept something, but you may not commit to doing it. So we want people who are committed. And one of the best things that I'd suggest you do is to ask people to commit. So just ask people, just say, look, can I get your commitment to complete these reports on time in future? There's nothing wrong with that, and it's very reasonable to ask that. The next question, of course, that you need to ask is, do they know how they're performing against those expectations? And of course, this is feedback. So have you given people some feedback on their performance so that they understand that they're not meeting, or they are meeting, the expectations that you have of them? And there's one final question that needs to be asked, and that is, are you supporting them to achieve those expectations? Are you supporting them? So, of course, that can be easily underestimated, but there are organisational barriers in the way. There are roadblocks that are there all the time. And as a leader and a supervisor, you should broach that subject. So what are the barriers in the way? You might preempt that with, or what are the roadblocks, or how can I make this easier for you? All right. So I think you've got to be able to answer those 7 questions in order to complete Pillar 1. So Pillar 2 is challenging unhelpful behaviour. So we're assuming, of course, that this is a performance scenario where perhaps somebody has performed in an unacceptable way. You'll notice that the first 2 pillars are task-focused. So these are pretty much focused on the task itself. You could probably guess that the last 3 are relationship focused. So let's have a look at what you can do with unhelpful behaviour. Now, one of the things that I think is very useful here is to use, it sounds a little bit complicated and slick, but it's not really, is to use this as your way of explaining unhelpful behaviour to people. It's based on situation, behaviour, and impact. It's a pretty simple model. Might sound a bit strange, but it's very simple. And it works like this. Let's say, for example, that I needed to have a performance conversation with somebody who has been quite negative in one of my team meetings. Now, I could say to them in a generalised way, you've been very negative in the team meetings. That's not going to end well. So I might try something a little bit different, and it's far more effective. I'm going to talk about the situation first. So I might say, Our regular Monday morning staff meetings are for sharing ideas and problem solving. So I've set the scene, right? My expectation about those particular meetings are for sharing ideas and problem solving. So I've said that. I then say, in the last 3 meetings, I've noticed that you've criticised 4 suggestions that Matthew and Karen have raised without offering a possible alternative solution. Now, that's the difficult part, of course. That's the behaviour that you are citing. But you've put it into context, haven't you, by explaining the situation. And then the final part of that, of course, is the impact. Now, this is important because the other person may not understand this. And sometimes as leaders, we think that people will just get it, but they don't. So what I might say there is, by doing this, you're affecting morale, and the others may not want to contribute their ideas. All right, can you see how that works? Now, the person might get defensive about that, but I can assure you they're far less likely to get defensive about that than if you just say, look, I want to talk about your rotten attitude in the meetings, the last 3 meetings we've had. So that's not going to work. So you need to try something different. So I'd strongly recommend you try that approach. Pillar number 3. Pillar number 3 is establish a trusting relationship. So now we're moving on to the relationship aspect of the dimension of authentic conversations. So let's look at trust. Now, obviously, trust is critically important, and you might like to ask yourself the question, how much trust do I have with my colleagues and team members? Some people walk around surprisingly as a badge of honour, suggesting that they have very low trust levels or something very bizarre. But you can't get much done unless you've got a reasonably healthy trust level happening. And of course, it's mutual, works both ways. So look, the 4 things that are on your screen there are the critically important factors in building trust. Now, there's a lot of things you can do to violate it. There are a lot of things you can do to build it. I could go through a huge list of 50 things and we get nowhere. But at the end of the day, here's the essence of it. I think if you treat people fairly, and there's a number of different types of fairness as well. There's procedural fairness, which is, of course, giving people making sure everybody follows a similar procedure. And there are other types of fairness which escape me at the moment. But generally speaking, fairness is critically important, particularly in, and I know not everyone is part of the Australian culture. We've got people from overseas, but in the Australian culture, fairness is critically important as a value. Recognise their positive contributions, and I don't think all the surveys in the world show that leaders just don't do enough of this. Give people some clear direction. Now, having your expectations sorted out will be a step in the right direction. But people want some clarity from you. They want you to set the pathway for them. And then, of course, they also want you to support their development along the pathway. So I think if you do those 4 things, just focus on those 4 things, it's likely that your trust level will build. And of course, the flip side's true, if you don't do those 4 things, your trust will erode. Okay, so pillar number 4. So pillar number 4 is an interesting one, and again, we don't do enough of this. By the way, folks, if you've got any questions or comments, don't forget, put them in as we go. I'm throwing a lot of information at you, of course, and if something's interesting you or you have a question, then please go ahead, because that's how we can make this as reasonably interactive as possible. So don't be shy, just type in your question over on the right-hand side. Okay, so while you're thinking about that, let's look at pillar number 4, showing genuine appreciation. So yes, as I was saying, all the surveys that we come across, I'm sure we've seen them all, suggest that employees don't feel that they are receiving genuine appreciation. Now, sometimes I think we do give genuine appreciation, and I think that it falls on deaf ears, or they don't appreciate the genuine appreciation, if you know what I mean. In other words, they don't realise that you're actually showing genuine appreciation. So it it's something that can get lost. You know, it's like when people give you a compliment. Sometimes we find that very hard to accept, and we tend to fob that compliment off, like, "Oh, this old thing, you know, I just pulled it. I just pulled it out of the wardrobe and just put the first thing on that I could find." Or, someone's just given us a compliment about our shirt or our coat or something. So, look, we're not generally pretty good at accepting that, but nevertheless, we should be trying to look for giving genuine appreciation. Now, how do you do that? Look, the simplest way, and I just think, again, we don't do enough of this, is just to say thank you. It's so simple to do, and we forget. I think we get into the habit of not saying it, and we might be thinking, well, because everyone else doesn't do it, I'm not going to do it. And then, of course, no one does it. But look, no one will ever be accused of saying thank you too often. Can you imagine someone coming up to you and saying, look, I just think you're thanking people way too much. I think you're saying thank you too much. It's not really likely to happen. So say thank you. And the other thing I would suggest that you might like to consider that's culturally taboo is to apologize when you make a mistake. If you do that, then you show a great degree of authenticity and strength. Don't try and pass the buck. Just say, I apologize, and get on and fix it. And, the reality is everybody knows that you made a mistake, so don't try and pretend that you haven't. Just get on with it. So just get in the habit of saying thank you more often is a pretty good way to start. Thank you for completing the report on time. I had a leader who once said to me that when and this person was a very senior leader, this person would come to work and she'd thank people for coming to work. Can you imagine this? Someone's plonked themselves in front of the computer screen with their cup of coffee and they bleary-eyed and they turn their computer on, and she walks up to them and says, thanks for coming to work today. That certainly wakes the person up very quickly, and the person says, what? You mean, did I have a choice? And of course, the leader then says, well, in fact, you did have a choice of coming to work today. And then just walks off, which is a thought-provoking way to just let the person know that they appreciate that they're there. Just got a question here, which I'll deal with now, from Patricia. Should relationship conversations happen first, e.g. at induction? I think they should be happening first, second, and third. I think relationship conversations should start, of course, when people join an organisation during induction. And I think sometimes in the inductions there's all this mechanical stuff that's going on, and very few opportunities for relationship building occurs. So I think that's the place to start. I often think that it's great to sit down with a new employee on the end of their first day and just ask them how the day's been in the first week and in the first month. I think that's a fair and reasonable thing for any leader to do, to show some appreciation. Thanks for your question. That's great. Now, let's go on to the final pillar, which is building for the future, which you can see that these three pillars here, of course, are the people-focused pillars. So let's talk a little bit about the whole notion of the future. Now, the whole reason that you're having a performance conversation, if you think about it, is to focus on the future. You can't change the past. So sitting down and whinging about what someone did, or pointing the finger of blame, or that sort of stuff is completely irrelevant, because you can't change the past. It's happened. And what you need to do, of course, is plan for the future. So the whole reason that you're having this performance conversation is so that you can work out and modify behaviour for the future. And I love this saying, I learn from the past, which is obviously important, which is why you're having this conversation. Live in the moment, so you're in the moment. There's no time like the present, and the fact of the matter is we've only got one moment, and it's right now, so to speak. So live in the moment, and of course plan for the future. And the conversation that you're having is about partly planning for the future, living in the moment, which is listening to what the person has to say and engaging fully in the conversation, and of course perhaps talking about the past only to learn something from it. Okay, so that becomes critically important, and I think that you should be planning for the future. Talk about what needs to change. A performance conversation is a behaviour modification opportunity. Nothing more than that. Nothing less than that. It is about planning a way forward for the future. So just remember that, because I think sometimes conversations can descend into slanging matches or blaming and you know, duck shoving and all sorts of strange behaviours. Just accept that what's happened. Identify what the barriers are. Talk to people about what those barriers are, and then talk to them about how they might improve those barriers. All right, so there's the model, and you can see there that all of those pillars do have some bearing on the other pillars. But if you miss any of those pillars, of course, you are in trouble. So, for example, if you don't establish a trusting relationship, then no matter how clear you are about your expectations, people aren't going to commit to those because they don't trust you. Or if people think you're just processing them through a conversation process, then they won't, they don't feel that you're showing them genuine appreciation. That's problematic as well. So it's a balance between a task and people. It's not all about people, and it's not all about task. So it becomes critically important to get those two distinctions correct. So if there's any last questions or comments, guys, I'm more than happy to accept them and talk about them. So while you might be thinking about that, let me just give a quick plug, if I may. On the 27th of April, I have a Lunch and Learn series commencing, and the 27th of April is not too far away, 2 weeks away, in fact. And I have a new series which is basically on developing high-performance teams. So a lot of the information that I've covered today and other information I'll be covering in 6 units. You can see on the left-hand side what those units are, which I think are the units that are critically important in terms of developing high-performance teams. So I would welcome you joining my series, my Lunch and Learn series on the 27th of April. And there's a little bit of an incentive for you today, because you have taken up half an hour of your time to listen to me. If you send me an email by the end of business today, I will give you a 10% discount on attending that Lunch and Learn series. Normally it is $295. You'll get a 10% discount if you send me an email by the close of business today. So folks, just a little plug there, and of course that you in those Lunch and Learn series, you get a set of slides, you get 6 recordings of 1 hour each. You get unlimited time with me via email for coaching purposes, and of course you get some homework, which is practical application in between the sessions, which are normally spaced 2 weeks apart. So anyway, enough of the advertisement. I've enjoyed working with you today. I can see that okay, we've got another question here. I better just respond to that. Talia asks, how do you best overcome employees' excuses when having conversations around unhelpful behaviour? Good question. What I suggest you do is you just say, you say, well, what might your reasons be for this? And then, of course, off they go into making a bunch of excuses, and you just say, well, which of those excuse? Oh no, you're going to use the word excuses. Which of those reasons can I help you with? Or which of those reasons can you do something about? And you go through them one by one. In other words, what you're doing is challenging them as such, which is really important. Thanks, Craig. Thank you for your informative talk today. I appreciate that very much. So I think that's the way forward. And Natasha, I think that was your question as well. So, folks, we'll finish there. Thank you for your involvement. And as I said before, you'll receive a copy of the slides and also the recording this afternoon. And think carefully about the Lunch and Learn series. So thank you very much for your involvement, and I wish you all the very best for the rest of your day and for your weekend. Thank you.